My husband threw a full glass of red wine in my face in front of 40 people because I said thank you to a man who complimented my dress. 2 weeks later, I stood in a courtroom and watched him lose everything he thought was his. He never saw it coming from me. He never saw anything coming from me. That was always his first mistake. Please support this channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing with your loved ones. Well, let's go. My name is Renata, 31 years old, and 8 months ago I was married to a man named Griffin Voss. I want to tell you about the night the drink hit my face, but first I need to tell you about the 4 years before it. Because none of this makes sense unless you understand how a person ends up standing still, while wine drips off her chin at her best friend's engagement party, and doesn't scream, doesn't cry, just stands there thinking, calmly, so calmly. Okay, now I have proof. I met Griffin at 26. I was working as a marketing coordinator for a mid-size hospitality company, the kind of job where you plan launch events and write copy. Nobody reads twice. Griffin was a regional sales director for a medical device company, older than me by 6 years, confident in a way that felt like safety at first and felt like something else entirely by the end. He noticed everything about me in those first months, my favorite coffee order, the way I twisted my ring finger when I was nervous. He remembered my coworkers' names before I did. Looking back, that wasn't romance. That was reconnaissance. The first red flag came 4 months in, and I didn't call it a red flag. I called it, he cares so much. We were at a work happy hour and a guy from accounting, a guy named Desmond who was objectively harmless and objectively gay, told me my presentation that week was sharp. Griffin didn't say anything at the bar. He waited until the car. Then he asked me in this quiet, even voice, "Do you always let men talk to you like that?" I said, "Like what?" He complimented my work. Griffin didn't yell. He just went silent for the rest of the drive, and the silence lasted 2 days. I spent those 2 days apologizing for something I still couldn't name. That was the pattern for the next 4 years. He never had to raise his voice. The silence did all the work. By month 8, he was checking my phone. Not sneaking around about it, he made it a condition. If you have nothing to hide, you won't mind. I didn't fight it, because fighting it felt like admitting I had something to hide, and I didn't, so why not just hand it over? That's the trap. That's exactly how it's built. By year 1, I'd stopped going to girls' nights unless he came too, because girls' nights turned into interrogations about who else was there, who I talked to, whether any of the girls had single friends hanging around. By year 2, I'd quietly stopped wearing a red dress I loved because he told me red, sent a message. I didn't need to be sending to anyone but him. I want to be clear about something, because I know how this sounds from the outside. Griffin was charming. Griffin was, by every external measure, a catch. He opened doors. He remembered anniversaries. He told my mother she raised an incredible daughter, and he meant it, in his own twisted way. Because to him I was something he had built, and something he was allowed to protect, the way you protect property. He proposed on a rooftop with a string quartet he'd hired in secret. I cried real tears. I said yes, and I meant it because I still believed, at 28, that the possessiveness was love wearing an ill-fitting coat, and that marriage would let it finally relax into its real shape. It did not relax. It tightened. We got married in a vineyard outside the city. 140 guests. My father walking me down a row of grapevines strung with lights. Griffin cried at the altar. Everyone said it was the sweetest thing they'd ever seen. A big confident man reduced to tears by love. I have a photo from that day where I'm laughing at something he whispered in my ear, and for years I kept it on my nightstand, and I want you to know that photo is real. The laugh was real. That's the part nobody tells you about a relationship like this. It isn't one long nightmare. It's 90 good days, and then one day that cancels out 90, and then 90 more good days to make you forget. And the cycle resets, and you keep thinking the good days are the truth, and the bad day was the exception. Until one night you're standing in a stranger's backyard with wine running down your collarbone, and you finally understand that it was never the exception. It was the architecture. The good days were the exception, dressed up to look like the whole house. There's a version of this story where I tell you Griffin was a monster from day one, and I was simply too naive to see it, and that version would be easier to hear, but it wouldn't be true. And I promised myself I'd tell this straight. The truth is messier. Griffin drove 3 hours to sit in a hospital waiting room when my father had a minor heart scare in our second year together, and he held my hand the entire night without once checking his phone. Griffin remembered that I liked my coffee with oat milk before I'd told him twice. Griffin cried. Real tears, at his own sister's wedding, moved by watching two people commit to each other. I tell you these things not to defend him, but because I think it matters that you understand a controlling man is rarely a cartoon villain. He is very often, simultaneously and without contradiction in his own mind, a genuinely tender person who also believes, somewhere underneath the tenderness, that the woman he loves is a territory that needs defending from other men, including men who mean nothing, including men who are simply saying thank you back to a compliment about a dress. The incidents piled up quietly over the marriage. I started, without really deciding to, keeping a mental list, and eventually an actual list, dates and details, in a notes app disguised under a folder labeled recipes, because I knew, somewhere under the part of me that still made excuses for him, that someday I might need it. March, our first anniversary, he grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise, because I'd hugged an old college friend goodbye a beat too long at a restaurant. I told my sister I'd slammed it in a car door. July, he accidentally deleted 6 months of my design portfolio off our shared laptop the week I was applying for a promotion, the week after I'd mentioned that a male creative director at the new firm had called my work genuinely exciting. He apologized so beautifully I ended up comforting him. October, he showed up unannounced at a work conference 2 states away because, he said, he'd had a bad feeling. I found out later he'd been reading my location the entire trip. By the 3rd year, he talked me out of 2 promotions because they'd mean travel, talked me out of a close friendship with a woman he decided was a bad influence for the crime of being divorced and happy about it, and talked me into believing that all of this was concern, was devotion, was a man who simply loved me more than other men loved their wives. The night everything cracked open was my best friend Priya's engagement party. Priya and I had been close since college, one of the few friendships that had survived Griffin's slow campaign of isolation, mostly because Griffin actually liked Priya's fiancé, a soft-spoken guy named Oren who talked to him about golf. The party was at Oren's parents' house, a beautiful backyard strung with the same kind of lights from my own wedding, maybe 60 people, an open bar, string lights, laughter carrying across the lawn. I wore a green dress I'd bought myself with my own money from a promotion I did finally get. The one Griffin hadn't managed to talk me out of because by then I'd learned to apply for things quietly and tell him after. I noticed Griffin watching me from across the yard within the first 20 minutes, the particular watching I'd learned to feel on the back of my neck like weather changing, and I remember thinking, with something close to exhaustion, not tonight please, not at Priya's party. I'd learned by then to manage him at events the way you manage a fire that's mostly contained. Stay near him, laugh at his jokes a beat too loud, touch his arm so other people see the touching and assume it means safety. I'd been doing exactly that for 2 hours. I'd gotten him a second drink myself, unprompted. The kind of small preemptive offering I'd learned kept the night calm. I thought I had it handled. That's the other thing nobody tells you. Right up until the moment it happens, you often believe, with total confidence, that you have it handled. I was standing near the dessert table when Priya's cousin, a man named Foster, visiting from out of town, someone I had met exactly twice in my life, told me the dress was a gorgeous color on me. That's it. That's the entire sentence. That's a gorgeous color on you, I said. Thank you, that's kind, and turned to reach for a napkin. Griffin was 10 feet away with a full glass of red wine in his hand. He crossed that distance in about 3 seconds. He didn't say anything first. He just threw it, straight at my face, the whole glass. Wine in my eyes, in my hair, down the front of the green dress I'd bought with my own money, dripping onto shoes I'd bought with my own money, onto a night that belonged to my best friend and had nothing to do with him at all. The backyard went silent, the way a room goes silent right before someone screams, except nobody screamed. 60 people just stopped talking at once. I remember the specific sound of the ice in his abandoned glass. I remember Priya's hand flying to her mouth. I remember Foster, the man who'd said 4 words to me, standing there with his own mouth open, looking like he wanted to disappear into the lawn. You don't get to look at other men like that, Griffin said. His voice wasn't even loud. That was the worst part. He said it like he was correcting a waiter about a wrong order. You embarrassed me. I stood there with wine running down my collarbone, my dress ruined, my makeup running, 60 people staring, and something in me that had been slowly closing for 4 years finished closing. I didn't cry. I want to tell you that clearly, because for years I thought crying was the honest response and not crying meant I was cold. But I have learned since then that sometimes the body simply runs out of tears for a person before the mind catches up. And that night my body was ahead of me. I looked at him. I said, very quietly, okay, just that, okay. And I walked into the house, into Priya's future in-laws' bathroom, and I locked the door, and I took out my phone, and with wine-soaked hands I opened a text thread with my sister and typed 6 words. I need you to come get me. Then I did something I hadn't planned and would not undo. I opened my camera and took a photo of myself in the mirror. Wine down my face, down my dress, mascara tracked down my cheeks, eyes flat and clear in a way I didn't recognize as my own. I didn't take it to post it. I took it because some cold, practical part of me, the same part that had been keeping the recipes folder for 3 years, understood that a photo taken at 9:47 p.m. with a timestamp and 60 witnesses was worth more than anything I could ever say about him afterward. That photo became the first page of a case I didn't know yet that I was building. My sister, Whitney, arrived 19 minutes later. She's 4 years younger than me, works in event logistics, and has a particular talent for showing up exactly when a person needs a getaway driver and asking questions second. She found me still in the bathroom, sitting on the closed toilet lid in a ruined dress, and she didn't say, "What happened?" she said. "Get up. We're leaving. Do you have your purse?" That's the kind of sister to have. We walked out through the kitchen, past Priya, who hugged me so hard I could feel her shaking, past Oren's mother, who quietly handed me a clean towel and said nothing except, "You call me if you need anything, sweetheart." Past Griffin, who was sitting at a patio table now, drink in hand, telling a cluster of increasingly uncomfortable men that I'd always had a thing for attention. I didn't say a single word to him on my way out. I have never regretted the silence. I stayed at Whitney's apartment that night. I didn't sleep. I sat on her couch at 2 a.m. and finally opened the recipes folder, and I read 4 years of my own handwriting back to myself, cold, in order, and it read less like a marriage and more like a slowly tightening rope, and I understood, sitting there in one of Whitney's old college t-shirts with wine still crusted in my hairline, that the drink wasn't the incident. The drink was just the first time it had happened somewhere with witnesses. The next morning I called my mother, Danielle, and I want to be honest here because this part of the story doesn't flatter her, and I promised myself I'd tell this straight. My mother's first response was not what I needed. Marriages have rough patches, Renata. He adores you. Everyone saw how upset he was afterward. Priya said he apologized to half the party. My mother had spent her own 30-year marriage smoothing over my father's temper, and she'd built an entire worldview around the idea that a woman's job was to be the thermostat in the house, always adjusting so the man never had to feel the heat himself. She wasn't defending Griffin because she didn't love me. She was defending Griffin because the alternative, admitting that a marriage could be this and still look, from the outside, like a fairy tale, was a truth she'd spent 30 years avoiding about her own life. I understood that later. That morning on the phone, all I understood was that my own mother was asking me to go home and apologize for embarrassing my husband, and something in my chest went very cold and very clear. He threw a full glass of wine in my face in front of 60 people. "Mom," I said, "for saying thank you." "I'm just saying don't do anything rash," she said. "You'll regret it." I hung up. I did not do anything rash. I did the opposite of rash. I did the most controlled, methodical thing I have ever done in my life. Whitney drove me to urgent care that morning, not because I was seriously hurt, a little redness near my eye from the wine's acidity, nothing that needed treatment, but because she understood, better than I did in that moment, that a medical record with a timestamp is a form of armor. The doctor documented everything. Whitney took photos of the paperwork on her phone. Then we drove to the police station, and I filed an incident report. Not a criminal complaint yet, just a documented account, with the intake officer, a woman named Sergeant Odalis Prieto, who listened to the whole thing without a flicker of the polite disbelief I'd braced myself for. "Has this happened before?" she asked. "Not the drink. Any of it. Grabbing, controlling behavior, isolation, monitoring your phone." I said yes. I said yes to all of it, out loud. To a stranger with a badge, for the first time in 4 years. "This is a pattern of coercive control," Sergeant Prieto said. "The party incident is assault. It doesn't matter that it was liquid and not a fist. It was an act of violence intended to humiliate and intimidate you in public, and it's documented by 60 witnesses and a photograph you took yourself. I want you to know your options. You can pursue a criminal complaint. You can pursue a protective order. You do not have to decide today, but I want you walking out of here knowing you have real, enforceable options, and none of them require you to convince anyone this was a big deal. It was a big deal. She asked me to walk her through the recipes folder, and I read her 4 years of dated entries out loud in a small interview room while she typed, and somewhere around the entry about the deleted portfolio she looked up at me and said, "You've been building a case file for 3 years without knowing that's what it was called. Most people don't have anything close to this level of documentation. This is going to matter." I didn't feel proud in that moment. I felt, mostly, a strange grief for the version of myself who'd started that folder quietly, 3 years earlier, some instinct in her already understanding what the rest of me wasn't ready to admit. I sat in that plastic chair and something in me that had been braced for 4 years finally set down what it was carrying. I filed for a temporary protective order that same afternoon. It was granted within 2 days, on the strength of the incident report, the medical documentation, the photograph, and, this part mattered more than I expected, 3 witness statements Priya had quietly collected from guests at the party who were willing to put in writing what they'd seen. Foster, the man who'd said 4 words about my dress, wrote one of them. He told the responding officer, unprompted, "I've thought about very little else since that night. I said 4 words to a woman at a party and watched her get assaulted for it. I'll say whatever needs to be said." I moved my things out of the house. Griffin and I shared over the following week, with a police escort for the exchange, standard procedure, Sergeant Prieto told me. Not because we assume the worst, but because we don't assume anything, and you shouldn't have to be alone in that house with him even for 20 minutes. Griffin stood on the porch during the move with his arms crossed, watching movers carry out furniture I'd chosen, boxes I'd packed, and said exactly one thing to me the entire time, low enough that only I could hear it. "You're going to regret humiliating me like this." I looked at him and said, "You humiliated yourself in front of 60 people for the price of a glass of wine. I'm just doing the paperwork." His family did not take it well. His mother, Corinne, called me 11 times over the next 2 weeks, then started calling Whitney when I stopped answering, then started calling my mother, all with some version of the same script. Marriages have hard seasons. Griffin was under enormous work stress. I was throwing away a good man over one bad night. I want to say clearly, for anyone listening to this who has heard that same script from their own in-laws, it was never one bad night. It was the first night with witnesses. That distinction is the entire story. Griffin's sister, a woman named Perpetua who I'd always liked actually, was the lone exception in his family, and she called me not to defend him, but to tell me something I didn't know. "He did this to his college girlfriend too," she said, quiet, like she was finally setting down something heavy she'd been carrying alone for a decade. "Not wine. He shoved her into a wall at a party because a guy asked her to dance. Everyone in the family knew. Nobody said anything because he was always so sorry after, and she was gone within the year anyway, so it felt like it had resolved itself. I should have told you before the wedding. I felt sick about that for 2 years. I didn't blame Perpetua. I understood, better than most people could, exactly how a family builds a wall of silence around a man like that, brick by brick, apology by apology, until the wall is taller than the truth. The divorce process moved faster than either of us expected, mostly because Griffin's attorney, once he actually reviewed the incident report, the medical documentation, the photograph, and 3 witness statements including one from a man Griffin had personally invited into his own home for golf, advised him in no uncertain terms to settle, rather than let any of it end up in a courtroom transcript that potential employers, or frankly anyone with an internet connection, could someday find. Griffin fought me on almost nothing in the end. Not because he'd grown a conscience, but because his lawyer had made it very clear that fighting meant the story would be told in public, under oath, with witnesses, and I moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city that October, 6 weeks after the party, with furniture Whitney and I found secondhand and painted ourselves on a Saturday with the windows open and terrible music playing. It was the first home I had decorated with absolutely no consideration for anyone else's opinion in 4 years. And I cried the good kind of tears the first night I slept there, in a bed nobody had ever told me not to make with the wrong color sheets. The professional part of my life, which Griffin had spent years quietly clipping the wings of, took off almost immediately once there was nobody left to talk me out of opportunities. I'd been sitting on a portfolio of branding work for small local businesses that I'd done on the side for years, cautiously, never telling him the full scope of it because he'd always found a reason it was taking away from us. Within 2 months of the divorce filing, I left the marketing coordinator job and started my own branding studio, working first out of my new apartment's second bedroom, then, within 4 months, out of a small shared office space downtown. My first real client was Priya and Oren's wedding venue, which needed a full rebrand, and the owner loved the work so much, she introduced me to 3 other venues in the same network. By the 6-month mark, I had 11 clients and had to hire a part-time contractor just to keep up with intake calls. I want to tell you about the moment I knew the business was really working, because it mattered to me in a way that had nothing to do with money. A boutique hotel chain reached out after seeing the venue rebrand, wanting a full campaign for their spring launch, 6 properties across 3 states. It was the kind of project that, a year earlier, Griffin would have found a reason to make me nervous about. Travel. Late nights. What kind of men run these hotel chains, Renata? I took the meeting alone, in a blazer I'd bought myself, and I got the contract, and I flew to the first site visit by myself, and I sat in a hotel bar afterward with a glass of wine I ordered for myself, and drank slowly and completely and without a single thought about who might see me drinking it. That was the moment. Not the contract. The wine, actually finished, in a glass nobody threw. 6 months after the party, my studio brought in more in a single quarter than I'd made in a year at my old job. I signed a lease on a proper office space with north-facing windows, hired a full-time junior designer, and started turning down clients whose values didn't match mine, a luxury I'd never had in my life before. I met Desmond. Yes, that Desmond. The accounting coworker from that very first happy hour 4 years earlier. The one whose compliment had started the entire pattern. At a mutual friend's birthday dinner about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, we laughed about the strange symmetry of it. He'd left the old company 2 years earlier and was running his own accounting firm now, and somewhere in the conversation he mentioned, gently, without prying, that he'd always wondered what happened to the woman from that happy hour who'd seemed so bright and so careful, like she was walking on ice she couldn't see. I didn't say anything back then because it wasn't my business, he said. But I noticed you got quieter every month I knew you. I told him the whole story eventually, over a much longer dinner a few weeks later, and he listened the way I now understand good men listen. Without flinching, without minimizing, without once asking what I could have done differently. We started dating slowly, carefully, on my terms entirely, and he never once asked to see my phone. My mother came around eventually, though it took longer than I wish it had. It happened, oddly, at Whitney's own engagement party 7 months after mine, when my mother watched a man across the room laugh a little too long at something Whitney said, and Whitney's fiancé simply laughed along instead of crossing the room with a glass in his hand, and I watched my mother's face change in real time, watched some old, buried recognition surface behind her eyes. She called me the next morning and said, without preamble, "I think I owe you an apology. I've owed you for longer than just this year." I let her say it. I didn't make it easy, and I don't think I needed to. Some apologies you accept slowly, on your own schedule, and that's allowed. I never spoke to Griffin's mother again after the divorce finalized, and I never spoke to Griffin again at all. Not once, not even the brief mechanical texts about mail forwarding, which I routed entirely through my attorney. Perpetua and I stayed in touch, quietly, a coffee every couple of months. 2 women who'd both loved the same family and learned 2 very different truths about it. I heard through Perpetua, almost a year after the party, that Griffin had been fired from the medical device company after a formal complaint from a younger female colleague, details Perpetua didn't have, and I didn't ask for, and that he was now selling insurance out of a strip mall office 2 towns over, living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment that Perpetua described, with something that sounded almost like relief, as very beige. I felt nothing when she told me. Not satisfaction, not pity, just the particular calm of a closed file. I had spent 4 years cataloging every version of him. Charming Griffin, generous Griffin, silent Griffin, wine-in-my-face Griffin. And none of those versions belonged to me anymore. He was simply a man I used to know, whose current apartment I would never see, and had no interest in seeing. Corinne, his mother, tried one last time about a year after the divorce finalized. A long voicemail left on a Sunday afternoon, her voice thick, saying Griffin had finally started therapy and asking whether I'd consider at least a conversation, for closure, for both of you. I didn't call back. Closure, I'd learned by then, isn't a conversation you have with the person who hurt you. It's a decision you make quietly, on your own, in a room he isn't in. I'd already had mine, sitting on Whitney's couch at 2 in the morning with wine dried into my hairline, reading 4 years of my own handwriting back to myself. Everything after that was just paperwork catching up to a decision I'd already made. Desmond and I got married 18 months after the party, in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard. 30 guests, no string quartet, just a playlist. Desmond made himself and a cake from the local bakery I'd rebranded that spring. My father walked me down a short aisle of folding chairs. My mother cried the real kind of tears this time. The kind that come from finally seeing something clearly. Priya was my maid of honor. Whitney gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then made everyone cry, about the night she drove 19 minutes to a stranger's backyard and found her sister sitting on a closed toilet lid, and how she'd never in her life seen anyone walk out of a bathroom that calm, and that finished with a chapter of her own story. I wore green that day. A different dress, my own choice, no wine anywhere near it. Last spring, a regional small business association invited me to speak on a panel about rebuilding a career after a major life disruption. And I almost said no, because I still, even now, feel a flicker of old instinct to keep my private life private, to not make a scene. Griffin's old phrase rising up out of some buried drawer in my head. I said yes anyway. I stood on a small stage in a hotel ballroom, the same kind of hotel ballroom I now had 6 client contracts with, and I told a shortened, careful version of this story to about 200 strangers, and afterward 11 different women came up to me privately, one at a time, to tell me some version of their own recipes folder. That was the moment I understood this story wasn't really mine to keep quiet anymore. 2 years after the party, my studio has 8 employees and a client roster I would have laughed at as a fantasy back when I was still hiding a side hustle in a notes app labeled Recipes. I still keep that folder actually, though it's grown into something else entirely now. Not evidence anymore, just a record, a place where I write down the good things instead. The contracts signed, the days that felt entirely mine. The first time Desmond asked me what I wanted for dinner, and actually meant it as a question and not a test. Sometimes people ask me, when they hear the shortest version of this story, whether I regret marrying Griffin at all, whether I wish I don't. And here is the honest reason why. I don't know that I would have believed anyone who tried to warn me, back then, any more than my own mother believed the truth of her own marriage for 30 years. Some lessons only take when they're written on you directly. What I don't regret, what I will never regret, is the exact moment I stopped crying and started documenting. The moment the wine hit my face and some cold, clear part of me said out loud in my own head, okay, now I have proof, instead of, what did I do wrong? That single shift, from apology to evidence, from silence to a folder full of dates, was the whole turning point of my life. And it happened in the space of about 4 seconds, standing in a stranger's backyard with 60 witnesses and a ruined green dress. He threw a drink in my face because I said thank you to a man who complimented me. He thought it would put me back in my place. He thought the silence that followed would work the way it always had, the way it had worked for 4 quiet years. Instead, I filed a report, kept the photograph, built the case, packed the boxes, changed the locks, and built a life. 8 employees and 1 very patient, very kind, husband, larger than anything he ever let me imagine for myself while I was standing next to him. He wanted to remind the room who I belonged to. What he actually did was hand me, without meaning to, in front of 60 witnesses, the exact moment I finally understood I had never belonged to anyone but myself. That was the real ending, not the drink. What came after it?